Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay. Never comes again, another day like yesterday. Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.
All right, how is everybody? I got one for you today that I really like the content, and I know what I want to say, but I don't have it organized in my head. So as per usual, I'll just sort of jump in and figure out what I'm saying and how I'm saying. And I can give you multiple examples of what I'm trying to illustrate from my own experiences. But this is something that is slowly cooked over the last 2 or 3 years. And obviously being a therapist really helps me see this because I sit and listen to people struggle with the human condition all day. But I'm going to make this statement and then I'll dig into it. My statement is this, and I'm serious about it, though it may sound a little bit too all-encompassing, but it is this. I would be willing to bet that 95% of all of the mishigas out there, people being mean to one another, people killing each other, conflict, cruelty, pettiness, people. I'll give you here's a concrete example. I ride to and from work when I can. There's a dedicated bike path along the metro line, but it does cross several intersections. And there's one intersection that's pretty wide, that's pretty unsafe. People are seem to always be in rush hour traffic, and there's always people trying to cram into the intersection, even though the light's already turned red, and so we as the bikers have it. So one day that was a situation, it was kind of rush hour, and we as bikers are trying to go through the crosswalk, and we have the light, but the light is turned red, and there was just enough space. There was a bunch of cars lined up all the way through, but there was enough space between a couple lanes of cars that we could get through on the crosswalk. And so just as we were pulling up, this woman in the car slammed on the gas and pulled her bumper right up and blocked our way. And the guy who was riding next to me was kind of like, what's the deal? And she flipped us off and was like, fuck you. Right? And so you look at that and you're like, well, that person's a little pretty neurotic and out of her head. She was in the wrong. She was sitting in the middle of a intersection. She had forced her car in there because she wanted to get through the light, and it wasn't going to happen. And it's understandable that she would be stressed out being caught in the middle of the intersection. But if there was room for us to get through, it was our right of way, and we were not being mean to her. We were just trying to go through in front of her car, and she was going to have to sit there. And she got triggered and behaved badly. Okay, so there's a situation where things like that happen a million times a day all over the globe. I don't have an opinion about her. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But that kind of stuff, and everything to way, way worse, to very, very small negative things that parents do, that I do as a parent, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff. Okay, here's my all-encompassing statement. The reason for all of that stuff is not what they tell you necessarily, that it's conflict over resources or conflict over whatever they tell you, whatever people tell you, right? All that mishigas comes down to one thing. With the exception of people who are enlightened or have been through lots of therapy or are just blessedly raised by pretty healthy parents, 99% of people on the face of the globe are all interacting with situations not based on what the situation is, but based on the fact that they think the situation means something about who they are, and they're trying to use the situation to disprove some negative thing that they think about who they are, or they think that other people think about who they are, or they're trying to force the situation to mean something good about them. So to put it more simply, 99% of people on the globe, and all the mishigas and the conflict and the poor behavior, like that woman who, again, I have no opinion, maybe she was having a really bad day, but she behaved very badly. She was totally in the wrong, and she was aggressive and insulting to us, the two bikers. All of that behavior is because people are negotiating their identity. They think their identity is being negotiated in that moment. And the intense defensiveness and the willingness to harm self and others, and the willingness to, well, maybe it's not willingness, but the situations over and over where you're like, oh my God, like what were they thinking? It's totally irrational. They're being totally psychotic. They're just crazy. They're out of their minds. Blah, blah. Those people are not out of their minds. Most people are not legitimately crazy. They don't legitimately have wiring problems. Most people are operating in an equation where they're attempting to solve some identity problem, either consciously or unconsciously, by using the situation or the circumstance to try to prove to themselves that they're not something negative, or to try to prove to themselves that they are something really good that will make them feel that they're not something negative. And I'll get more into that component. Okay, so I'm going to say this again. This is the point. 99% of the people on the face of the planet are not dealing with situations or circumstances based on what it actually is. They're not even trying to figure out what the thing actually is. They're trying to negotiate the situation and circumstance in order to disprove something that they unconsciously believe about themselves that's really negative and they're terrified might be true, or they're trying to make the situation show them as something that would disprove some negative thing. Right? Sorry, I got distracted by a text. I'm such an unprofessional podcaster. Okay, so how do we explicate this? Part of the reason I know this is I've seen into some deep, deep, dark, unconscious beliefs in myself that were driving my interaction with situations and circumstances. And I'll share with you a sad one, but I feel okay enough that I have no problem sharing it, that I realized recently. Last month, at the end of the month, my father passed. As I've shared in essays and other situations, I had been estranged from my father, literally no conversation really, for about 10 to 15 years. And then when my oldest sister passed away about 9 years ago, I was thrown back in contact with my family, and I did not reestablish a relationship with him. I did with my brothers and sisters. But I sort of became aware and sort of monitored his well-being through my brothers and sisters. And that mattered to me, right? And then ultimately, at the end of last month, he died suddenly. He was dying slowly of dementia, but then suddenly they realized that he had stage 4 cancer. They discovered it, and within 2 to 3 weeks, he just suddenly died. Blessedly, with no pain and suffering. Just boom, that was that. So there was some grief, there was some stuff, right? But a lot of it was, for me, was do I go or do I not go? And if I do, like, why am I doing it? Do I genuinely feel this profound feeling that I want to go and grieve my father and do it with my brothers and sisters? Or, there was a period of time, 0 to about 10, where my dad was significantly cruel to me. And then he was kind of nice to me for about 8 years when he thought I was going to take over his business. And then once he realized I wasn't, then he became extremely dismissive and just basically mostly ignored me for the rest of his life. Right? So this was a significant question. You know, am I trying to prove something? Do I genuinely want to go? Do I want to go and support my brothers and sisters? Blah, blah, blah. So I was sort of agonizing about all of this. And through a process that I shared in an essay that I won't go into now, I was able to sink down into a very deep conscious awareness of what was going on for me. And I realized that all of the cogitation and agonizing whether I should go or I should not go and feeling a little tormented by the process, blah, 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 really was because I was not evaluating the situation based on the life I had actually lived, who my father really was for me, and who I really was, but from these negative self-perceptions. So due to the way I'd been raised, the perception had been built in my family that I was crazy, overly sensitive, emotionally unstable, blah, blah, blah. This was done mostly by my mother to cover some really horrible things that she did, that she didn't want me telling my brothers and sisters, and she didn't want them believing if I did. But I internalized this belief, right, that I'm unstable, that that I'm too sensitive, blah, blah, blah. And I deeply realized, I'm still navigating the situation to try to disprove this. I'm a therapist, so I'm very sensitive to nuances and blah, 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 but that just means I'm more skilled at lying to myself. The truth is, all of the agonizing or whatever is because the real motivation between my question of whether I should go or not really was driven by this neurotic feeling that I somehow had to disprove to myself and others that I wasn't that person. And that I also had to put on a demonstration for my mother, who had very significantly gaslit me and done everything she could to convince my brothers and sisters that I was emotionally unstable, a liar, blah, blah, blah. Again, because she out and out was doing everything she could to bury a couple of really horrific things that she did when I was very young. And I was also unconsciously trying to prove something to her. Right? So there's this identity struggle going on that I'm projecting into the situation. My father, who ignored me for most of my life and was significantly cruel for portions and was only nice to me when he thought I was going to take over his company and work with him in his company. Whatever, no judgment, just that's actually what the situation was. That's how he behaved with me. I'm also a person in the situation who had a certain childhood and blah, blah, blah. When I took the identity struggle out of the way and evaluated the situation, I realized from a very clean place that wasn't resentful of my mother, resentful of him, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I realized this is silly. After what you lived through, why would you do this? Why would you expose yourself to, for example, grieving and being in a very vulnerable state in my mother's presence, who still is completely lying and will do anything and was happy to sabotage my relationship to my brothers and sisters, and still would if it would serve her purposes. Right? Why would I go sit in a room with her? Like any thought of like, but I can assert myself, it really was just an unconscious attempt to prove to myself that I was emotionally stronger than I was before. It was like I wasn't emotionally weak before. Had been horribly treated and was badly traumatized, but I was not weak. So I was trying to disprove something that I had internalized, an erroneous belief about myself. I was trying to negotiate my identity, but not even my true identity, just some unconsciously internalized neurotic lies about me that I had internalized and signed off on and was still running this program. And once I truly saw that and was relieved of the identity struggle, I could see very clearly, no, I don't mean this as punishment or disrespect to my father or my mother. Like, other people are suffering, and some of them really suffering in this situation, Even if my mother treated me horribly, that doesn't mean that she's not suffering terribly. She is. In fact, the reason she treated me horribly is because she was suffering, right? That's right. So it came out of no disrespect for them or a lack of empathy or understanding. It was just like, that's not the right thing for me. For someone who had this relationship and suffered this relationship, it was not the right thing. Once I saw the entire situation for what it was, without projecting my neurotic, unconscious attempt to negotiate my identity and to try to disprove something negative that I believed about myself, like whether you're trying to prove something positive, you're doing it to disprove something that you unconsciously believe that's negative, or you're directly aware that you think something negative about yourself and you're trying to disprove it. I'll go into that because that's an important component. Okay, so there's an example. So I used the example, and I won't take up all the time to give you tons of examples, but I used the example of that young woman. I don't know her. I don't know what was going on, but we're disingenuous, or at the least we do ourselves a disservice when we always make everything about trauma and you're in your fight or flight state. You know, that young woman definitely was in a state of fight or flight or anxiety or stress. Like, for sure, you could see, I'm a therapist, like I could see in her eye set and her body language, she was behaving very badly, but she was quite stressed, and I think she felt ashamed and embarrassed that she was a person who got caught, right? So this stuff is going on, but we do ourselves a disservice when we stop there and just go, oh, it's just trauma. People behave badly because they're in a fight or flight state. Fight or flight states are not driven by horrible, traumatizing childhood circumstances. They are driven because when we have horrible, traumatic experiences, we often internalize a really negative perception of self. That's always true for childhood trauma, but remains somewhat true for adult trauma, and can be much truer for people who are being socially assaulted or have a negative gaslighting narrative about them, right? So women, there's a lot of negative narratives about women and their place in overall society. So if a woman is assaulted or mistreated, there's a much greater chance that this will actually contribute to an already installed negative perception of self. And then she will be in a traumatic state or in a traumatized state, right? And this is true for everyone and anyone. And the point is not to say that those people are weaker or they're more prone to trauma and to shame them, but is to say that what we consider trauma doesn't result just from the painful experience. It results because we internalize some horrible perception about self and our value. And I'm not blaming you for that. I've spent 50 plus years sorting out trauma personally. So I'm not criticizing you, and I'm not trying to be dismissive that horrible, violent experiences can result in trauma or whatever. But what I'm saying is it's not the pain and terror of the experience that creates the trauma. It is an internalized belief about self that anchors trauma in and leaves people spending decades struggling with a traumatic response to the thing. Right? I'll give you another personal example for me. My mother had real issues. And without going into it and throwing her under the bus and talking about stuff, you know, I grew up in an age and in a culture where almost everyone whipped their kids. But my mother whipped the shit out of me. Multiple times a week, left welts on my legs, etc., etc. She whipped me so hard when I was like 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, that sometimes you just ended up in a fetal position just begging, please stop, please stop. It hurt so bad. It was beyond my capability as a child to deal with, right? That was extremely painful. But I can tell you right now that it was the psychological stuff she did in addition was 1,000 times more destructive, and that in fact, I don't think I'm that traumatized from those whippings. You can come near my legs, you can smack me in the back of the leg. I don't have a flashback. Because a lot of those whippings and the cruelty of it came out of a culture, and there were many times that she whipped me that way just because it was her culture. She was a rough farm girl who was raised by a very rough farmer in an age where that was not that uncommon. And I can tell you in my own work, I've had to do little to no work, EMDR, trauma recovery, PTSD, with being whipped. Now, there are ways that she whipped me and things that she said and intense shaming and whipping me in ways that were incredibly unfair. For example, being beaten up by my older sister and then crying and asking for help from her and her whipping me because she was really sick. She was a black and white parent who once she decided you were the bad person, that was it, right? So my sister could beat me up, and every single time she would say, it was your fault. You're the one who starts it, and she would whip me for the fight, right? So the unfairness and the sickness of that created a lot of trauma for me. But the whipping itself didn't. I've never done an EMDR session nor had a conversation with a therapist about the pain of being whipped. And it was extremely painful. It was far beyond my capability to handle. But because many times when she was whipping me, not all of those whippings were done with the shame, with the sickness that she brought and traumatized me. Many of those whippings were not done with that. They were inappropriate and they're not the right thing, and no one should do that, and it's very cruel. But I was not traumatized long term by the whippings because it was just part of a culture. And it hurt really, really badly, but at least 50% of the time, she wasn't doing it in a sick way. She was just doing it because that's what parents did. Now, there were times that she was really sick about it, and the sickness got to me, right? But just the pain itself didn't. So what I'm telling you is, the pain or the violence of the thing is never what really locks in PTSD. And I know people are going to freak out and they're going to be like, you're full of shit. You can't tell me that, some poor child who's in a war zone and hears bombs going off and now can't hear firecrackers and shakes and, blah, blah. Yeah, I can tell you that. You know why? Because everything that terrifies children creates an identity. That's what children do. When we're traumatized as children, we build it in as identity. So a child who's in a war zone, who's maybe not being touched by anybody, internalizes it as, I don't deserve to be safe. Nothing is safe. Nothing will ever be safe. And this is what I deserve. That is why childhood trauma is so destructive. Because children internalize almost everything. Or they'll just internalize the helplessness of it as, I'm helpless by identity. I'm helpless by identity. Right? So this is why I'm saying, for example, I'm not criticizing women. When I say there's a lot of negative messages about women, especially about their bodies and men's right to them and blah, blah, blah. So as an adult, if a woman is assaulted, there's a much greater chance that she will retain and struggle with long-term PTSD over that assault, because it is the identity struggle that locks it in, not the violence. It's the identity struggle that locks it in, not the violence. She's been surrounded by messages since she was a child that her body is meant to serve, and that she should be nice and she should be kind, and that her identity is wrapped up in what she appears like. And then some man finds her attractive but has no respect for her as a human and assaults her and violates her in a very vulnerable and personal way. And there's a part of her unconscious identity that's telling her, well, that's just kind of what happens to you. That's what women are. Now, we all know that's insane, but it's unconscious. It gets built in. And then her difficulty with dumping the trauma of that will be not because it was violent and horrific, but because she has an identity belief that says, yeah, but it kind of fits. It should maybe stay here. Maybe you kind of deserve to be treated this way. That's why it sticks. That's why it sticks. I've also said this many times. In my own work, there are many things my mother did to me that were far, far, far more horrific and far more difficult and got inside and were just a massive decades-long struggle than the physical things that she did. Right? For example, she identity shamed horribly. I'll give you one example. My mother laughing at me in this mocking, mean girl tone between the times I was like 3 and 6 or 7 years old did horrible damage and internalized something deep, deep, deep in me that said something like, your most profound pain in social situations is a joke. It doesn't matter, and it's funny to everyone, but especially to women. I struggled with women laughing for decades, unless I was in on the joke and it was clearly aimed at someone else. But if a woman just observed like a foible of mine and just kind of laughed kindly, I couldn't, right? I remember one specific time I had built a Lego city and my sister was trying to kick it down. And I was crying and trying to hold her back. And then my mom, who was in a borderline state and really, sometimes she was really psychotic, came in and was like, let's get him, boys against girls. And she helped my sister kick down the city. And I was broken. I couldn't, my brain could not wrap around, how could my mother join my older sister in bullying me and hurting me? And I was sobbing, and she laughed and went, I think it's so funny, like he just do, he gets so angry and just stomp, do. And she mocked me trying to salvage my pride and like stalking out of the room at the age of like 5 or 6, right? That memory, I think I'm done with it, but was just a vicious, complex trauma with a profound, powerful impact on me that nothing physical that I ever experienced came anywhere near touching, because it was about identity. Because it was about identity. Because she was shaming me socially. She was sending the message that what you make doesn't matter. It's okay for your older sister to bully you and beat you up and to destroy things that are important to you and things that you have created. And not only that, what you create is so meaningless that even your mother is going to join and knock it over. And if you feel devastated and you sob, it's so meaningless that it's funny to me. Now, whether she intended that or not, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying, guys, as a 5-year-old, that's the meaning that I made and internalized. And I lived with that inner program running in relationship to women, and in relationship to mean women, and in relationship to people laughing, and it generalized to anyone. There was a long time people couldn't laugh with me about anything. Even if I said something genuinely funny and everyone laughed, I would instantly cringe and shrink and go into this freeze state, as if my mother was mocking me after she kicked over the Lego city that I built. Okay, that's a pretty sad, disturbing example, right? But let's bring it back to the point. I'm not saying this to be dismissive or to act like violent trauma doesn't matter. It matters, but a lot of why it matters is because we as humans don't just experience the violence, which results in a fight or flight response that sometimes stays too long. What I'm telling you is fight or flight that stays too long and concretizes into chronic PTSD is only when there is an intensely negative and shameful belief identity system built around it that sustains it for decades. Only. Without that in place, the nervous system resolves the PTSD. This is why, for example, and I spoke to someone on special forces, and he had asked me, about why I think, there are some people who go into war and see horrific things and leave and they're fine, and the other guy goes to war and comes back, and 10 years later he's committed suicide because he was an intense alcoholic with severe PTSD for a decade. I know the answer, and he also knew the answer. The people who go into war and come back severely traumatized such that it destroys them were already fairly traumatized from childhood. They already have a bunch of deeply internalized, their nervous system's already twitchy, they already have a certain level of PTSD, but I would be willing to bet in every case there's a bunch of complex PTSD, and the complex is really about identity. It's about identity. So they went into that violent conflict and those violent experiences already with a bunch of shame and overwhelming identity that's already concretizing and holding them in a fight or flight state. And they experience war, and it only deepens and locks it in that much deeper, to the point that if they don't get some really skilled help and a lot of insight into what they're experiencing, they're on the road to suicide. And very often, if a person is not deeply internally insightful, that person has no sense that they have deeply internalized negative beliefs. That it's about identity. And identity, negative identity, is always about shame. And nothing is more destructive to the human animal than shame. No emotion is more destructive to the human animal than shame. No emotion is more destructive to the human animal than shame. Okay. Everything that's going on out there, people's poor behavior, is always because they are negotiating who they are and trying to make the situation show that they're not who they fear they are, or make the situation prove that they're something good. Neither one is good, because no one goes into situations trying to prove that they're something good unless they already believe something bad about themselves. Nobody goes into a situation trying to prove something good unless they already believe something bad about themselves identity-wise. There is no value in negotiating your identity ever, because it has no relationship to reality outside of you. Reality outside of you is neutral. It's just situations and circumstances. Okay? I'm getting a little tired and it gets a little dense. So let me close it with this. Any belief you have about identity, any struggle to negotiate your identity is based on a fallacy, is based on an erroneous belief, and is based on some negative thing that you believe about yourself that's not true. And I'll tell you why that's true. I've shared this before. I realized something startling as a therapist. Everyone who comes in to work on something ultimately is only working on what they think of themselves. Okay, there are lots of people who have difficult situations and circumstances, but their most difficult challenge is that those difficult situations and circumstances get to them because they believe that it confirms something about them, something negative, and they believe the negative thing. So in the end, to really deal with the situation circumstance, they have to first resolve that they believe something negative about them. Okay? Go one step further. What was really startling is when I realized, as people heal, and people do, and resolve their traumas and get to a better place, no one ever sat in the chair in my office or the couch in a healed state and went, "Oh my God, John, fuck, can you believe it? Thank you so much for all this work. I feel so much better. I realize that I really am a piece of shit. I am just a toxic piece of shit. Now that I know," never. If some people really are toxic pieces of shit, once they heal, why isn't it because they've gone, "Oh my God, I realize I'm a toxic piece of shit"? What you realize when you heal is that what you are is beyond valuation. It's something beautiful, it's something mysterious, it's something joyful, powerfully creative, powerfully connected, full of awareness and wisdom, and there's nothing to be negotiated. So the identity battle stops. When you heal, the identity battle stops. When you actually know what you are, the identity battle stops. When you actually know what you are and begin to experience what you are no longer willing to negotiate your identity because you know that your identity cannot be touched by situations and circumstances. This leaves you free to negotiate situations and circumstances based on what they actually are. Because whatever happens, you succeed, you don't, you misread it, blah, 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 it doesn't mean anything about you. It doesn't mean anything about you. I think there's a lot longer podcast to be done on the idea of negotiating identity. But I think I want to leave it with this now because I'm a little tired. My daughter's been sick and my wife and I have not been sleeping well. Once you heal, what you realize is there is no identity to be negotiated. What you truly are is mysterious, beautiful, powerfully creative, connected, wise, present, and it is something that transcends situations and circumstances and cannot be defined by situations and circumstances. Therefore, you are free of all the neurotic struggle and worry and, "Oh, well, but if I do this, I'm a bad person." Nothing that you do here on the face of the planet can define your value. Your value is that you're beyond value. And once you let go of identity negotiation, you're free to actually see what situations and circumstances are without using it to try to make something true or untrue about you. That's the good news, my friends. All right, I'm going to close there. Reiterating the statement. 99 of the mishigas going on the face of the planet is because everyone, unless they're enlightened or had amazing parents, is constantly using situations and circumstances to try to negotiate an improved value to their identity. And the only reason that's happening is because they've internalized some erroneous negative belief about who and what they are, and they're trying to free themselves of it. All the insanity on the face of the planet is that. That's a statement I make. That is a hill I will die on. I'm right. Feel free to debate me in the comments. I love you guys. Have a great week. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Just for today, everything's okay, everything's okay.